The year is 1848, and Europe stands on the precipice of radical change. Revolution simmers in the streets of Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. Workers toil for 14 hours a day in dark, dangerous factories. Children as young as 6 labor in coal mines. And in Brussels, a 30-year-old German philosopher puts the finishing touches on a manifesto that will shake the foundations of the modern world. His name? Karl Marx. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. With these words, Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels opened the Communist Manifesto, a text that would become one of the most influential political documents ever written. But what drove this bearded intellectual to pen such fiery prose? What did he see in the capitalism of his day that inspired such a comprehensive critique? And why do his ideas continue to resonate with millions around the world nearly 2 centuries later? Today, we dive deep into Karl Marx's critique of capitalism, a system he didn't merely criticize, but dissected with scientific precision, exposing what he believed were its inherent contradictions and inevitable demise. Born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, to a middle-class Jewish family that had converted to Christianity, Marx was no stranger to the political turbulence of his era. He studied law and philosophy at the universities of Bonn and Berlin, where he was heavily influenced by the ideas of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. But unlike Hegel, who focused on the realm of ideas, Marx turned his attention to material conditions, the economic realities that shape human existence. The Europe of Marx's youth was undergoing a profound transformation. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain in the late 18th century, was spreading across the continent. Traditional agricultural societies were giving way to industrial capitalism. Peasants were becoming wage laborers. Small craftsmen were being replaced by factories. And a new class was rising to prominence, the bourgeoisie, or capitalist class, which owned the means of production. In Paris in 1844, Marx witnessed firsthand the brutal conditions of the working class. He saw children with stunted growth from years of factory labor, women whose hands were permanently stained by textile dyes, and men whose lungs were ravaged by coal dust. In Manchester, England, then the heart of industrial capitalism, Friedrich Engels, Marx's lifelong friend and collaborator, documented these conditions in his 1845 work, The Condition of the Working Class in England. Engels described workers living in squalid tenements, working dangerous jobs for meager wages, and dying decades before their wealthier counterparts. It was against this backdrop that Marx developed his critique of capitalism. At its core, Marx's analysis rests on the concept of historical materialism, the idea that economic systems determine the structure of society, including its politics, law, culture, and dominant ideas. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, Marx wrote in 1859, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. According to Marx, human history has been a progression of economic systems, each defined by its mode of production. From primitive communism to ancient slavery to feudalism, and finally to capitalism, each system contained internal contradictions that eventually led to its downfall. Capitalism, Marx argued, would be no different. But what exactly did Marx mean by capitalism? For him, capitalism was not simply a system of markets and private property. It was a specific social relation between 2 main classes: the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, who own nothing but their labor power, which they must sell to survive. This brings us to one of Marx's most important concepts: exploitation. Under capitalism, Marx argued, workers produce more value than they receive in wages, what he called surplus value. This surplus is appropriated by the capitalist as profit. In Capital, published in 1867, Marx wrote, "Capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks." To illustrate this, consider a worker in an English textile mill in 1850. She might work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, producing cloth worth far more than her weekly wage of perhaps 10 shillings. The difference between the value she creates and what she's paid goes into the pocket of the factory owner. This exploitation, Marx argued, is not a bug but a feature of capitalism. It's how the system functions. Marx also identified what he saw as fundamental contradictions within capitalism. One of the most important is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. As capitalists compete with each other, they invest in labor-saving technology to cut costs. But since, according to Marx's labor theory of value, labor is the source of all value, reducing the amount of labor in production eventually leads to declining profits across the economy. Another contradiction is between the social nature of production and the private appropriation of profits. Modern industry requires thousands of workers cooperating in complex production processes, yet the fruits of this collective labor are claimed by individual capitalists. These contradictions, Marx believed, would lead to recurrent crises. And indeed, the capitalism of his day was marked by boom and bust cycles. In 1825, 1836, 1847, and 1857, financial panics swept through Britain and other capitalist economies, leading to widespread bankruptcies, unemployment, and suffering. During the financial crisis of 1857, which spread from the United States to Europe, Marx, then living in exile in London, wrote excitedly to Engels, "I am working like mad all, night and every night collating my economic study so that I at least get the outlines clear before the deluge." That deluge was the revolution he believed would inevitably result from capitalism's contradictions. The most profound contradiction of all, in Marx's view, was between the forces of production, technology, labor power, resources, and the relations of production, the social arrangements that govern how production is organized. As capitalism develops, Marx argued, it creates an increasingly socialized production process while maintaining private ownership. This tension eventually becomes unbearable, leading to crisis and revolution. Marx was not merely a critic of capitalism, he was also a theorist of alienation. In his 1844 Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, he described how capitalism alienates workers from their labor, from the products they create, from their human nature, and from each other. Consider a skilled cabinet maker in pre-industrial Europe. He would design a piece of furniture, select the wood, craft each component, and assemble the final product, experiencing the satisfaction of creative labor. Under industrial capitalism, this same craftsman might find himself in a factory, performing the same repetitive task hour after hour, day after day, creating products he would never own or even see completed. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces, Marx wrote, the more his production increases in power and size. This alienation extends beyond work. In a capitalist society, Marx argued, human relationships are reduced to economic transactions. Even the most intimate connections are corrupted by market logic. As he and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. The commodification of everything under capitalism troubled Marx deeply. He was particularly concerned with the concept of commodity fetishism, the way the market obscures the social relationships behind the products we buy. When we purchase a shirt, for example, we see only its price tag, not the conditions under which it was produced or the people who made it. This brings us to another key element of Marx's critique: false consciousness. Marx believed that capitalism generates ideologies that hide its true nature and convince the exploited to accept their exploitation. Religion, nationalism, consumerism all serve to divert attention from class struggle. The ideas of the ruling class, Marx and Engels wrote, are in every epoch the ruling ideas. Take, for instance, the ideal of equality before the law. In theory, both a factory owner and a factory worker have the same legal rights, but their vastly different economic positions mean that this formal equality masks substantial inequality. The worker may technically be free to negotiate their wage, but economic necessity forces them to accept whatever terms they can get. Marx's critique wasn't limited to the capitalism of his day. He also analyzed colonialism as an extension of capitalist exploitation. In 1853, he wrote about British rule in India. England has broken down the entire framework of Indian society without any symptoms of reconstitution yet appearing, creating the only social revolution ever heard of in Asia. Throughout the American Civil War, 1861-1865, Marx wrote extensively about slavery and capitalism. Despite being in dire financial straits himself, he corresponded regularly with Abraham Lincoln and saw the struggle against slavery as connected to the struggle for workers' rights. In 1864, Marx wrote to Lincoln on behalf of the International Workingmen's Association, "The American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes." Not all of Marx's predictions have come to pass. The advanced capitalist countries have not experienced the revolutions he anticipated. The working class in these nations has often been integrated into capitalism through higher wages, welfare states, and consumerism. And attempts to build socialist societies inspired by Marx's ideas in Russia, China, and elsewhere have produced mixed results at best and horrific tyrannies at worst. Yet many argue that Marx's fundamental insights remain valid. Capitalism continues to generate vast inequality. The richest 1% of the global population now owns nearly half of the world's wealth. Economic crises still occur regularly, most dramatically in the global financial crisis of 2008, which bore striking similarities to the crises Marx analyzed in the 19th century. Global capitalism still depends on exploitation. In Bangladesh, garment workers earning a few dollars a day produce clothing for Western brands. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, miners extract cobalt for smartphones under dangerous conditions. Marx might see these as examples of what he called the reserve army of labor, a surplus population that capital can exploit for maximum profit. Environmental degradation represents another contradiction Marx might recognize. The ceaseless drive for profit and growth that characterizes capitalism has pushed our planet's ecosystems to the breaking point, what Marx called the metabolic rift between human society and nature. On March 14, 1883, Karl Marx died in London, an exile who had spent much of his life in poverty, supporting his family through Engels' financial help and occasional journalism. At his funeral in Highgate Cemetery, attended by just 11 people, Engels declared, "His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work." Engels was right. Whether one views Marx as a prophetic genius or a dangerous radical, his critique of capitalism has profoundly shaped our world. His ideas inspired revolutions in Russia, China, Cuba, and elsewhere. They influenced labor movements, anti-colonial struggles, and intellectual thought across the globe. Even his harshest critics must engage with his analysis. Perhaps most importantly, Marx challenged us to see economic systems not as natural and inevitable but as human creations that can be understood, criticized, and ultimately transformed. In his Theses on Feuerbach, he wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." In our own time of growing inequality, precarious work, and ecological crisis, Marx's critique continues to resonate. We need not accept all his conclusions to find value in his questions. Who benefits from our economic system? What are its hidden costs? And could we create something better? As we grapple with these questions in the 21st century, Marx's voice echoes from the past, reminding us that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history not just of class struggles, but of human beings seeking to understand and shape their world.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.